Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, Trump makes a new argument in the classified docs case involving presidential immunity. President Biden vows to stay in the race as he campaigns in the key battleground state of Wisconsin. What's in the latest strategy and what Biden supporters are telling us? Iris Chow reports. The Wisconsin Supreme Court has changed its mind. Ballot drop boxes can now be legally placed across the state. Arlene Richards explains the contradictory decisions. The UK officially has a new prime minister. Former leader Rishi Sunak has stepped down. Who took over the role and key takeaways from both as they address the public today. The Hungarian prime minister lands in Moscow for what he's calling a peace mission to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. Other EU leaders push back. Luis Martinez has the update. And are we getting closer to a ceasefire in Gaza? What Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office says. Arian Pazdar has the Middle East updates.
This is NTD Evening News. Live from our NTD Global Headquarters in New York City, here is Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Former President Trump is claiming immunity again in the classified documents case. In a motion filed today, Trump's attorneys asked for more time to submit additional arguments on immunity. In light of the Supreme Court's recent ruling, Trump's legal team is now asking the court to allow supplemental briefings on the issue. The team previously filed an immunity motion in February. They argued today that pausing some of the proceedings is necessary to allow the judge to analyze whether the alleged conduct is official or unofficial. Trump faces 40 felony charges related to his alleged mishandling of documents marked classified after leaving office in January 2021. He's also charged with attempting to obstruct the Justice Department's investigation. The former president has pleaded not guilty to all charges. President Biden vows to win the November election amid speculation about his campaign. That's as he's ramping up efforts to target battleground states. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Chow has more from the president's rally in Madison, Wisconsin.
Campaigning here in the key battleground state of Wisconsin, President Biden again vowing to stay in the race.
That some folks don't seem to care who you voted for. Well, guess what? They're trying to push me out of the race. No! Well, let me say this as clearly as I can. I'm staying in the race.
Yeah! Biden also highlights issues such as abortion, democracy, and the economy.
How about the 200,000 jobs we announced yesterday? You think I'm too old to beat Donald Trump?
While here, Biden also taped his first TV interview since the debate with ABC, which will air at 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. All these efforts were announced by the White House this week in a bid to show that the president is out in the public and has the ability to prove his record.
I'm not letting one 90-minute debate wipe out 3.5 years of work.
Some Biden supporters here told me that they're closely watching the president's performance these days to see how he's doing. But many others told me they're supporting him as the Democratic nominee, no matter what.
Dangerous. We know what we have in Biden. You don't know what somebody else might bring to the table.
You can't just switch horses in the middle of the stream. Who would take over?
I think we're pretty late in the game. We wouldn't want to turn away people that are already on the fence of even voting in the first place, right?
Well, I've heard a lot of people speaking today about that very thing and how they are watching.
President Biden's campaign on Friday announced what it calls an aggressive travel schedule in which Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris will travel to every battleground state this month, with Biden expected to engage in, quote, frequent off-the-cuff moments. His campaign is also launching an advertising blitz targeting battleground states and events such as the Republican National Convention in 10 days here in Wisconsin. And next week, Trump will rally in Florida and Pennsylvania, while President Biden will hold a press conference at a NATO summit in Washington, D.C. before getting right back on a campaign trail with a swing through the Southwest. Reporting from Madison, Wisconsin, Iris Chow, NTD News.
The Wisconsin Supreme Court today reversed course on its own decision in a case involving ballot drop boxes. The new Democrat-led court ruled that boxes can be used throughout the state. This comes after its Republican-led court in 2022 placed limitations on drop box use. Our legal correspondent Arlene Richards explains.
In a 4-3 decision on Friday, the Liberal-led Wisconsin Supreme Court decided that ballot drop boxes can be placed in communities across the state. Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, writing the opinion for the court, said that a Wisconsin statute allows the use of drop boxes because it doesn't specifically state that the boxes are prohibited. The court wrote the law doesn't include any insight into the actual meaning of the absentee ballot rules. Under the statute, a voter must mail or deliver in person the completed absentee ballot to the municipal clerk. Priorities USA, a progressive voter group, had argued that delivering a ballot to a drop box is the same as delivering it in person to the municipal clerk. The majority agreed. The decision contradicts a July 2022 ruling by the same court that banned widespread use of the boxes on the grounds that the Wisconsin Elections Commission doesn't have the power to enact policy regarding ballot drop boxes. They said only the legislature could. The then GOP-led court limited the use of drop boxes, ruling that they could be placed only in local election clerks' offices and no one other than the voter could return a ballot in person. The legislature does allow for alternate drop box locations, saying in the statute that the designated site shall be located as near as practicable to the office of the municipal clerk or Board of Election Commissioners. The switch comes in the aftermath of a 2023 judicial election won by Democratic Judge Janet Protasewicz, which flipped the court to liberal control. All three conservative justices dissented. Justice Rebecca Bradley, writing the dissenting opinion, criticized the majority for ignoring the precedent set by the 2022 ruling. She wrote, "The majority again forsakes the rule of law in an attempt to advance its political agenda." Absentee voting became more popular during the pandemic in 2020. In Wisconsin, at least 500 drop boxes were set up in more than 430 communities for the election that year. More than a dozen each were located in the state's two most heavily Democratic cities, Madison and Milwaukee. Republicans have alleged that drop boxes facilitated cheating in that election. The majority explained that its opinion doesn't require municipal clerks to use drop boxes. They wrote, "It merely acknowledges that clerks may lawfully utilize secure drop boxes in an exercise of their statutorily conferred discretion." Arlene Richards, NTD News.
It's his first day on the job, and UK's new Prime Minister Keir Starmer has already formed a cabinet. World leaders are sending their greetings to the new government in London. Starmer appointed 22 Labour Party members of Parliament to form his cabinet. Most noticeably, half of them are women. Rachel Reeves is the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary. World leaders reacting to the new government include President Biden. He congratulated Starmer in a phone call and posted on X, quote, "I look forward to our shared work in support of freedom and democracy around the world." French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and Israeli President Isaac Herzog all said they look forward to working with the new administration. The Conservative Party was dealt a historic defeat in this election, its worst ever loss. Here's a closer look at the state of politics in the UK.
Change is the word Labour leader Keir Starmer used again and again in his victory speech. The centre-left Labour Party pulled off a historic win in the general election, ending 14 years of Conservative rule.
You fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now.
Starmer's party won in a landslide, with over 400 of the 650 seats in the British Parliament. The Conservatives, also known as the Tories, lost over 240 seats Thursday. These included the seats of several ministers, as well as that of former Prime Minister Liz Truss. It's the first time in 100 years that a former Prime Minister has been ousted from Parliament. Many voters say they are frustrated with how the government under Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak handled the pandemic and the cost of living crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Sunak conceded defeat early this morning.
The British people have delivered a sobering verdict tonight. There is much to learn and reflect on, and I take responsibility for the loss.
But Starmer's government may not enjoy a so-called honeymoon phase. The results show Labour's vote share, that is the number of votes it received, stayed almost the same as when it lost in 2019. A large part of that vote was snapped up by the centrist Liberal Democrats, who gained more than 70 seats. And another up-and-comer is the UK Reform Party. Only 4 years old, the party has appealed to many formerly Conservative voters. Led by firebrand Nigel Farage, the Reform Party says it will, quote, stand up for British culture, identity, and values. Farage was elected as a member of parliament on his 8th attempt. He says reform aims to fill a gap on the centre-right of British politics.
Believe me, folks, this is just the first step of something that is going to stun all of you. Thank you very much.
Other big results came from Scotland, where a resurgent Labour Party took many seats from the Scottish National Party. The SNP is pushing for Scottish independence from the UK. Their poor performance in the general election throws the prospect of an independence referendum into doubt. Voters reacted to the election outcome.
14 years of Tory chaos, and we are finally out of it, and we are out of it with a huge bang.
I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to have some competent governance moving forward.
With ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza and a post-COVID economy, Labour is going to have its work cut out for it. In his victory speech, Starmer said, "You have voted. It is time for us to deliver."
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow today. EU and NATO leaders distancing themselves from what Orban called a peace mission ahead of next week's NATO summit in D.C. NTD's Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has more on this story.
The Hungarian Prime Minister's visit to Moscow drew immediate criticism from the European Union, particularly as the trip comes days after Hungary took over the European Union's rotating presidency. The EU Commission made it clear that Viktor Orban's trip to Russia was disavowed by the regional bloc.
The substance of this trip is not the right one. This is about appeasement. It's not about peace.
The rotating presidency has no role in the external representation of the EU, and that the Prime Minister Orban has received no mandate, actually, to visit Moscow.
Earlier this week, Prime Minister Viktor Orban met with Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev, the first time the Hungarian Prime Minister has visited Ukraine since the beginning of the war.
I think this is the most important issue for Europe. And during the forthcoming 6 months under the Hungarian presidency, this is war and peace. So my target is to be here to understand how we could be helpful to Ukraine in the forthcoming 6 months.
Viktor Orban proposed a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine to the Ukrainian president in order to advance peace talk. Volodymyr Zelensky rejected the proposal, and the U.S. State Department seconded that motion.
We and the NATO alliance have been clear that there really is only one solution here, and that is the Russian Federation simply leaving Ukrainian territory.
Secretary General of NATO Jens Stoltenberg was careful not to criticize Viktor Orban's peace negotiations. Orban is expected to meet with more than 30 heads of states next week in Washington, D.C. during the annual summit of NATO and the 75th anniversary of the military alliance.
What is important is that all allies, also Hungary, agrees that Russia is the aggressor.
It's important to note that Prime Minister of Hungary Viktor Orban met with French President Emmanuel Macron and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni ahead of his visits to Kiev and Moscow and ahead of next week's NATO summit. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
Israel and Hezbollah keep firing rockets at each other across the Lebanese border. Will this escalate into a wider conflict, or is a ceasefire in sight? NTD's international correspondent Ariane Pasdar has an update on the tensions in the Middle East.
Ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas now seem to be making some progress. Israeli officials returned from Doha on Friday, where they spoke with mediators. That's according to the office of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But although there seems to be some progress now, negotiations have to continue next week. Netanyahu's office says the reason no middle ground has been found yet is because there are still gaps between the sides. Earlier on Friday, Hamas said that mediators reacted positively to the proposed amendments by the terrorist group. But Hamas added it doesn't know yet what Israel thinks about the amendments. Fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, meanwhile, keeps ramping up. The IDF said that 8 projectiles fired from Lebanon fell in different areas in Israel on Friday. The military also claims it managed to hit the sources of the launches in Lebanon and a military structure where terrorists have been hiding. A day earlier, a mall in northern Israel was hit after a rocket barrage was intercepted overhead. Video shows that Israeli firefighters and security gathered outside the mall after it was hit. This came just a day after an Israeli soldier was stabbed to death at a different mall in Israel. And lastly, Iran is holding runoff presidential elections on Friday. It's a tight race between a moderate lawmaker and a hardline former nuclear negotiator. But the election will have little impact on Iranian politics because it's still the Ayatollah who calls the shots. Arian Pastar, NTD News.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Parts of the West Coast and Southwest will be baking hot this weekend due to an intensifying heat wave. Nationwide, nearly 140 million people remain under heat alerts. The temperatures could even break a world record. California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and Arizona are bracing for potential wildfires. They are opening cooling centers and warning residents to stay indoors and stay hydrated. An unusually long heat wave is intensifying and spreading, at least through the middle of next week. Much of the region will see temperatures well into the 100s and 110s, with highs in the 120s possible in the desert Southwest. Death Valley National Park could reach around 130 degrees and break the world record. The highest temperature ever recorded on Earth was 134 degrees in Death Valley on July 10, 1913. Hurricane Beryl made landfall in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula earlier this morning. Americans are now bracing for impact as the storm moves towards Texas this weekend. NTD's Fiona G has more.
In the Caribbean, authorities said the severity of damage from Hurricane Beryl is tangible and devastating.
In Grenada, our partners said that the hurricane caused extreme damage to the islands of Carriacou and Petit Martinique, where 70% and 97% of buildings were damaged, respectively. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 90% of homes on Union Islands were affected, while on the island of Canouan, nearly all buildings sustained damages, with roofs ripped off and severe shortages of water and electricity reported.
At least 11 people have been killed so far after the hurricane ripped through Jamaica, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and northern Venezuela. The storm system is currently unleashing strong winds and torrential rain over the Yucatan Peninsula, as well as dangerous storm surge on the coast. Mexican authorities advised residents to remain in their homes or seek refuge in storm shelters. Beryl has weakened rapidly as it crosses the Yucatan Peninsula and is now categorized as a tropical storm. But the storm will still dump 10 inches of rain in some areas of the Yucatan, potentially triggering flash floods. Forecasts say Beryl will regain strength when it moves over the Gulf of Mexico. The National Hurricane Center predicts that the storm will become a hurricane again before making landfall in South Texas late Sunday night. Authorities are warning about dangerous rip currents along the Gulf Coast. Houston, Austin, and San Antonio are all expected to be hit. Authorities in Texas say that everyone should be paying attention to the storm and making emergency preparations. Officials are reminding people to make sure their cars have gas, stock up on food and water, and check in on family members. Fiona G., NTD News.
Over in North Dakota, fire investigators are on the scene of a train derailment. 29 rail cars carrying hazardous chemicals fell off the tracks and caught fire early this morning. This happened in a remote area about 140 miles northwest of Fargo. Investigators say no one was hurt in the accident. According to a North Dakota environment manager, the cars are carrying anhydrous ammonia, sulfur, and methanol. Emergency workers say there is minimal threat to people who live near. They say winds are carrying the toxic smoke away from the nearest town of about 20 people. Fentanyl continues to cause thousands of overdose deaths in California, but lawmakers are hoping to change that through education. A new bill recently signed into law will require students to learn more about the drug.
California public and charter school students are required to learn about the dangers of fentanyl under a newly signed law by Governor Gavin Newsom. Existing law requires high school students grades 9 through 12 to learn about sexual harassment and violence. The new legislation, Assembly Bill 2429, would amend the state's education code to require fentanyl education. It will be taught through existing health courses as a prerequisite for high school graduation, beginning with the 2026-27 school year.
Fentanyl, originally created in 1959 for medical pain, has evolved into an incredibly fatal drug. The statistics are sobering. Fentanyl is now the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 49.
Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid And according to the California Department of Public Health, it's up to 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. There were more than 6,000 fentanyl-related deaths in the state in 2021, the most recent data available from the state health department.
As with most issues, education is our strongest tool against the spread of fentanyl, and AB 2429 ensures that our high school students are comprehensively educated about the dangers of fentanyl and equipped with the tools to protect themselves and others.
Proposed high school coursework would include information about what fentanyl is, the differences between legal and illegal use, the lethal dose of fentanyl, and how often fentanyl is laced into illegal drugs without users' knowledge. It will also instruct students about fentanyl-related hypoxia, which occurs when body tissues do not receive enough oxygen after the drug is ingested and cannot maintain homeostasis. Additional instruction will provide information about fentanyl test strips and how to obtain naloxone, an opioid overdose reversal drug.
What is the state of the post-pandemic economic recovery? More jobs are being added, but the unemployment rate has risen to its highest level since November of 2021. Unemployment has increased now for the third month in a row. Today's labor report shows unemployment ticked up to 4.1%, though it's still much lower than the 6% levels we saw during the pandemic. Job creation in June exceeded expectations at 206,000 jobs, due mainly to a surge in government employment. 70,000 more government jobs, followed by 49,000 in healthcare. New data also shows that hiring slowed last month. This means the job market is cooling, which is good in the eyes of the government because a hot job market could keep inflation elevated. Some economists say this is indicative of the soft landing that the Fed hoped for as they hiked interest rates to slow inflation. How will the new British Prime Minister lead the UK economically? Here's a look at his likely policies.
The UK has a new Prime Minister. Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party.
Our country has voted decisively for change.
The new PM's economic priority, wealth creation.
The mission that stands above all others will be raising Britain's productivity growth, a goal that for my Labour Party will become an obsession.
In a speech late last year, Starmer acknowledged that this is not the traditional Labour Party, but he says change is necessary.
He's a technocrat, he's not an ideologue. He will pursue things that he thinks is going to work, and that, above all, he will pursue things that he thinks will produce economic growth.
Politics professor John Curtis says the public shouldn't expect much difference in the new government's fiscal policies. Starmer even talks about reducing taxation.
The backdrop to this is rather unusual. Taxation and spending have risen to record levels under the previous government. Therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that the Labour Party is not necessarily looking to expand the role of the state.
Starmer's plans for growth include reducing regulations to boost the construction and infrastructure sectors, including renewable energies. Starmer says he won't raise the corporate tax and that tax cuts for the working class are a good thing.
It is also important to note what Keir Starmer means by working people, because he, when probed on this, he did say that it was people who were unable to write a check when things went wrong.
Financial expert Antonia Medlicott says people who own their own homes and work full-time can't be sure they're included. She says it's still early.
We're going to have to wait and see, because they have to get their feet under the desk. Obviously, all of this money needs to come from somewhere.
Starmer says he plans to stand for security and moderation, calling his policies securonomics. He says his government is committed to a calm and patient rebuilding.
Well, an ongoing investigation by China into brandy imports from Europe lead to a tariff war with the EU. Here is NTD's Don Ma.
Rising tensions between China and the EU in what appears to be retaliatory measures. Beijing announced the next step in its anti-dumping investigation in European brandy imports on Friday. The Commerce Ministry said that it will hold a hearing on July 18th to discuss claims that European brandy Producers are selling into China at below market rates, and China has repeatedly urged the EU to cancel its EV tariffs and said it is willing to negotiate. It said it does not want to be embroiled in another tariff war, but will take all steps to protect its firms. The hearing on European brandy will be held 2 days before the deadline set by Brussels for EV makers to comment on the provisional EV tariffs. All right, that's all from me. Back to you.
Joining us now to explore the trade tensions with China and the future of trade relations are two guests. William Ruger is president of the American Institute for Economic Research, and Anders Score, who is the publisher of the journal Political Risk and Principle at Core Analytics. Thank you both so much for joining us. William, I want to start with you. China is hinting at retaliation against the new 37% EU tariffs on Chinese EVs, with China set to begin its anti-dumping investigation on European brandy. How do you read these moves? Is this a new trade war?
Well, the way I read it is that a lot of people, particularly consumers and exporters, are going to suffer from this. I think that it would be much better for both China and the European Union to see this trade as mutually beneficial rather than seeing it as something where you have to have one side win in a zero-sum game. And unfortunately, I think the politicians are ignoring a lot of the economics here. And again, there are serious challenges with how China engages in international trade, particularly when it comes to IP protection. We also have to be concerned about dual-use technologies when it comes to an important strategic adversary of the United States and of the West. But again, trade wars are losers for consumers, and we should hope that both countries would find a path towards, I think, a better approach, a more mutually beneficial win-win approach.
And Anders, what is your take on this? Would you agree with William?
Well, I think he's got a good point. However, the key issue here is that the U.S. and European car industries are going to be completely destroyed if China has free reign in our markets. I mean, they're coming in with price points of $50,000 on average per electric vehicle, and U.S. and European vehicles are more on the $70,000, $80,000 per vehicle. So at that price point, our cars are just going to be destroyed in the market, and China's going to take over essentially.
And expanding on that point, Anders, staying with you, how does what's happening over there impact the U.S.?
Well, that would be a huge effect on U.S. jobs. I mean, American car companies are major employers. European car companies are major employers. It's also a point of national pride. You would see these companies go down the drain very rapidly if you didn't have tariffs.
And William, this is an election year here in the States. Given that, how does this tariff war impact future U.S.-China trade relations under the next administration, whoever that is?
I mean, you've seen a lot of similarities between the Biden administration's approach to China on trade and the Trump administration, the previous Trump administrations. I think, again, one of the challenges here is like what's good politics isn't necessarily good economics. And I'd like to think that if President Trump comes back into office, that he'd be looking to kind of, if you will, swagger around these things, use, I think, a kind of a threat here to achieve something that actually could be beneficial in terms of how America trades with China, as opposed to it being something where we have a continuing ratcheting up of tariffs across the globe. We saw what happened in history when we saw trade wars. It contributes particularly during times of economic challenges. Otherwise, it can contribute to deepened recessions or depressions. And so again, I think that I think the better angels will, I think, find their way here, especially because if you see a recession in the United States, a tariff war would actually increase prices, could increase the problems on inflation, and could lead to less trade and thus potentially a worse recession.
And Anders, Trump mentioned during the recent presidential debate that he would slap 10% import tariffs on all incoming goods. China has hit back with a spokesperson saying, quote, no one will win a trade war or a tariff war. Now, if Trump wins the presidency in November, is the U.S. in for a bigger trade war with China than under his first term?
I definitely think the U.S. would increase tariffs under President Trump. The effect on consumers is actually often overstated. the Goldman Sachs did a study in which they found that only about it only increased inflation. Trump's tariffs on China only increased inflation by about 25 cents on a $100 bill. That's really not a lot of money. What has happened with over the past 20, 30 years of free trade with China is that its economy has exploded, and with that, its government revenues have exploded, and that has led to, massive military spending on the part of China. And this is how they're threatening our allies like Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. So the fact that this could get us into a massive war and is already causing our defense spending to increase is a hidden cost of these cheap cars.
And William, would you agree with Anders' assessment? What would be the impact on consumers here?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think consumers suffer from tariffs. Now, there are other considerations at play, like national security concerns, where it might be, where absolute free trade would not necessarily be in the best interests of the public good. But again, when it comes to the kind of the pure economic trade, as opposed to things that affect national security, I think that, again, we have to be concerned about what consumers will face, how it will relate to a potential recession, how it would relate to inflation. And again, I think that, my sense of President Trump's approach here is that President Trump is he's a negotiator. He's someone who wants to, I think, really push in order to get a better deal at the end of the day. And I think that's what he would do here. I don't think he would want to crater the economy, particularly early in a Trump 2 presidency, in a way that would affect other changes or other approaches to issues across the board that he'd like to see changed from a Biden administration that he's not been very happy with. So again, I think that the, economics is a little bit like gravity here. We can't ignore it, except to our woe, right? We have to remember you don't want to jump out of airplanes because you're not going to go up. And I think the same thing happens with taxes and tariffs and other things. It's not going to be good for our economic health at the end of the day. But that doesn't mean that in the short run, using it as a bargaining tool can't be an effective part of a kind of statesmanship or diplomacy.
On that note, Anders, what should the U.S. economic policy be towards China under the next administration, whether that's Trump, Biden, or someone else?
I think your guest has hit it on the head. We need to use tariffs, essentially, or economic policy as a bargaining tool with China. It's an incredibly dangerous country. The U.S. and Europe are its biggest customers. We buy a lot of their stuff, so we have a lot of influence with China, but only if we use it as leverage. So we have to use these tariffs and other economic sanctions on China to leverage it away from its current disastrous path towards World War III, basically.
And William, same question to you. What should the next administration's economic policy be towards China?
I think it has to be careful, right? I think decoupling would be dangerous. Decoupling is the kind of move that you could imagine creating massive economic problems for the United States and China. And then the question is who would be suffering more, not who's actually benefiting. And also you have to worry about the possibility of economic, decoupling, leading to actually creating a self-fulfilling prophecy when it comes to a clash between China and the United States more broadly in the military realm. So I think we have to be careful. We have to remember that things like the oil and steel embargo that were placed upon Japan before World War II were things that contributed to strife between these two countries. And I think the United States and China are best served if they don't go there. I also think our allies and partner in Asia are best served if we don't go there. So again, I hope that this is more of a way, things like talking about these tariffs is part of leverage gaining, as opposed to something where we really see a move towards decoupling that could be rapidly destabilizing and ultimately bad for the United States.
William Ruger, Anders Keir, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Tensions in the South China Sea are intensifying. Today, Taiwan reported more Chinese military aircraft nearby. That's after Chinese officers arrested crew on a Taiwanese fishing boat earlier this week. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the details.
Taiwan's defense ministry said on Friday that it detected 26 Chinese military aircraft off its coast. They were carrying out a joint combat preparation drill with Chinese warships. The Chinese aircraft flew into Taiwan's north, center, and southern airspace. In the last 5 days, Taiwan has detected at least 127 Chinese military aircraft operating near the island. This comes just a couple days after Chinese officers boarded a Taiwanese fishing boat and arrested the crew members. The boat was operating off the coast of Kinmen Island. It's only 4 miles from mainland China, but it's controlled by Taiwan's government. Taiwanese officials said that there's some overlapping areas where fishermen from China and Taiwan work, but that the boat was seized in one of them. Here's the White House's response.
So on the fish boat, we're obviously closely monitoring the incident, so we're going to continue to do that. We encourage both sides to maintain open lines of communication so they can get to a resolution here.
And on top of all this, last month, China's Coast Guard rammed and damaged 2 Philippine Navy boats, which caused injuries to Filipino Navy personnel, and they seized rifles and equipment.
You have seen PRC actions be inconsistent with a stated goal, perhaps, of de-escalation.
Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer now for your sports news. We're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, a lot going on, but let's start in soccer as Spain topped Germany 2-1 with a late goal in extra time at the Euro 2024. What was this match like?
Very intense. These are two of the best teams in the world. In the quarterfinals, and there's an elimination game played right there in Germany. As you said, it was a very late goal. A header by Mikel Moreno in the 119th minute. Germany really threw everything they had at Spain just to force extra time. They finally got a goal in the 89th minute by Florian Wirtz to tie the game at 1. Spain really needed to win this though before it got to penalty kicks, I thought. I mean, that's very difficult to do in a hostile environment. And as I said, this was played right in there in Germany. Anyway, the German fans, unfortunately, were stunned by the end result, but it was quite a match, though.
Now, the second match this afternoon was another thriller, France beating Portugal in a quarterfinal game. How did they do it?
Defense first and then finally in penalty kicks. This went all the way to the wire. No scores until the penalties. Then there was only one miss there, and then that was all it took for France to advance. Now, what this means, Cristiano Ronaldo has played his last match in this event. The 39-year-old has more appearances here than anyone else, also has more goals scored as well. He made his penalty kick at the end, but it wasn't enough. Now France will face Spain in the semifinals, and that'll be played on next Tuesday over there in Germany.
Moving to Wimbledon news, defending champion Carlos Alcaraz had to come back from a 2-1 deficit to win in 5 sets today. Just how close was this match?
Alcaraz didn't face any match points, but late in the 4th set, he was tied 4-4, down 2 sets to 1. Love 30 on his serve before he reeled off 4 straight points to win that game. Now, this is him against American Francis Tiafoe. Had Alcaraz lost that game, Tiafoe would have been serving for the match. Instead, Alcaraz ripped off 4 straight points. He won the 4th and in a tiebreaker. Took the 5th set, somewhat easily 6-2. So it was close, but Alcaraz into the 4th round. Now on the women's side, Coco Gauff breezed into the 4th round with a straight sets win. She'll face fellow American Emma Navarro there. And also another American, 12th seeded Madison Keys advanced to the 4th round as well with a straight sets win. She'll face French Open finalist Jasmine Paolini now in the 4th round.
And Dave, moving to Olympic news, the World Anti-Doping Agency said they are disappointed to learn of a U.S. criminal investigation into why 23 Chinese swimmers were allowed to compete despite testing positive for a banned substance. Can you expand on what happened here?
Yeah, this story broke a couple months ago by the New York Times and German broadcaster ARD. They reported that in 2021, 23 Chinese swimmers tested positive for a banned substance, yet were allowed to compete at the Olympics. Some of them even won medals, and some are part of the team heading to this year's Olympics as well. Now, the Chinese Anti-Doping Agency blamed it on food contamination, saying traces of it were found in a kitchen of a hotel that they were staying at. The World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA as they're known, accepted that explanation and determined they were in no position to challenge it. Now, the U.S. government is allowed to have this kind of international investigation, though, thanks to the 2020 Rodchenkov Anti-Doping Act, which is named after the Russian whistleblower who exposed Russia's doping agency or scandal a few years back. Now, several U.S. Olympians, especially even Michael Phelps, have come out recently with critical comments about WADA citing this case. Now, it should be mentioned that the drug in question that was somehow in the kitchen of the hotel that they were staying at This is the same one that got Russian figure skater Kamila Valieva a 4-year Olympic ban. So this is no small thing.
Dave, as always, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tiff.
At the Hopkins County Jail in Kentucky, inmates are trading in canned food for fresh produce. The jail's garden, started in 2017, is not only transforming diets, but also lives. NTD's Daniel Monahan speaks with jailer Mike Lewis about the project.
Jailer Mike Lewis says they started the garden back in 2017 with just a small used tractor.
Since then, we've just kept growing and expanding and buying bigger equipment and doing more. At one point, we had almost 3 acres of garden out here on the property around us.
Fresh produce like corn, tomatoes, zucchini, and peppers are plentiful.
Everything that we grow, we bring in, harvest to give to the kitchen. The kitchen cleans everything up and prepares it so they get fresh vegetables through most of the summer.
For those serving time, the fresh vegetables are a welcome change from the canned foods often on the menu. Many of those incarcerated never had a garden growing up.
It's all a new aspect for them, and seeing that, being a part of that, and helping learning those skills. So it's been pretty eye-opening seeing adults who don't know anything about it, have never been involved in it, and are learning from the beginning. It's been pretty rewarding to be able to see them learn something, a valuable skill like that now they've never been exposed to before.
Lewis says caring for something greater than themselves can have a transformational effect on inmates.
Anytime you're tasked with the responsibility of taking care of something else and making sure that it continues to flourish, I mean, this isn't just paint a wall and we'll come back in 10 years and paint it. If you don't take care of it, if you don't do what needs to be done today, it might not be here tomorrow. And so it definitely teaches a reliability and an ongoing effort to keep it growing and keep it alive and keep it producing like it should.
Not only are prisoners thriving in the program, but the jail also saved around $11,000 on the food budget last year.
We do the entire garden project at zero cost to the taxpayers, but then it'll save the taxpayers money by not having to buy canned goods during the summertime. So it's been a great economic impact for the county.
Lewis can't be sure any of the inmates will continue gardening once released, but believes they'll definitely be taking a priceless gift home with them.
It's kind of like baseball or football when you're a kid. You may not play it for a living, but you learn a lot of valuable skills about working with other people, working together, caring for something, making sure that it works, and realizing that there's a lot of things bigger than us, and sometimes you got to do that as a team.
From fresh produce to invaluable life skills, the Hopkins County Jail is planting seeds of change. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.